out. We've just had David Lammy and Keir Starmer back from Washington. They've been meeting Biden and other officials from the administration in the White House. And I'm not sure, I was looking up just before this meeting started, has there been a clear result of this meeting? I still haven't found it. So I'm just doing it on the basis of hunch. We were told that they'd agreed, quote unquote, a strong position. This is clearly in reference to Storm Shadows. This is the British version of Scalp, the Anglo-French tactical ballistic missile. This is obviously in reference, as we know, to Ukraine and Zelensky's agitation about being allowed to use this weapon, not against Russian occupied territory in Ukraine, i.e. Crimea, Donbass and the south, but against Russia itself. And thus far, America has said no, not only no to its own technology being directly used against Russia, but also its allies' technology in terms of missiles being used in that way. Now, my guess is in terms of that, what such an attack would rely on is, first of all, Western intelligence, and really what I mean by that is American intelligence, i.e. spy satellites, but also, I would guess, American know-how when it comes not only to targeting, but programming the missile where exactly it's going to strike, because we're not talking about some equivalent of V1s or V2s from World War II. We're talking about pretty accurate, you could use the term pinpoint accuracy when it comes to such missiles. So the purpose of these missiles isn't simply to inflict terror on the enemy population. There they are in St. Petersburg or Moscow. It's actually to take out command posts. It's actually to hit logistical hubs. It's to take out, militarily important targets. And of course, everyone knows that in order to do that, you've had to have the direct cooperation with US military and perhaps British personnel. I would guess that would be the case with Storm Shadow, but that's just me. I don't know enough to say that definitively. Either way, of course, this debate happens in the context of Vladimir Putin saying, if you agree to this move, then it amounts to a declaration of war by NATO against Russia. You could certainly make the argument that it would make them a belligerent. Does that mean that we stand immediately on the threshold of nuclear war in Europe or a generalized nuclear exchange between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States? I don't think so, but I'd certainly make the argument that the nature of this conflict from a pretty early stage, certainly after stage one, is it's had all the signs of being something equivalent broadly, just broadly, not exact, but broadly equivalent of, the Western Front in World War I. Effectively static lines with slow grinding advance here or there. True, we have seen some dramatic Ukrainian advances. Initially, we saw dramatic Russian advances. True, we've seen the incursion into the Kursk oblast, but nothing decisive. There's been no decisive movement. And indeed, all the signs are that this year there'll be no breakthrough by Russia no collapse of the Ukrainian army, and vice versa. So, you know, the Kursk incursion isn't going to lead to the collapse of the Russian army. It looks like things will grind on for some considerable time. And precisely under those circumstances, there is on both sides an incentive to up the ante, both in terms of rhetoric, which is clearly what Putin has been doing. He did it over, I think, F-16 fighter bombers, you know, mainly delivered from Western Europe. But he also did it, if my memory serves me right, with the delivery of main battle tanks, such as the Challenger 2. Britain moved first, all 12 of them. I don't know how many still are in service. Crucially, Germany with the Leopard 2, and America followed up with, again, a handful or so of its Abraham tanks. Either way, my suspicion, for what it's worth, is that what strong position means is that Britain has been given the go-ahead to give Ukraine the go-ahead. Now, they're not going to say it openly. What they're going to do is when a Storm Shadow missile lands somewhere in Russia, then they might admit it, that they've given permission, because you can't disguise it, because they will be made in Britain. Here's the parts, here's the serial number, and all the rest of it. So they don't seem to be announcing it, but that seems to be what the go-ahead is. Now, my understanding is that, for what it's worth, is that Russia has already moved its important command posts inside Russia beyond the range of Storm Shadows. Storm Shadows, just to emphasize the point, are delivered from air. But of course, the reality for both sides, actually, when it comes to aircraft, is that they have to do it now. They have to launch their missile. They have to launch even glide bombs from well in their own safety zone. We're not talking about Ukrainian F-16s, for example, traveling all the way into Russian airspace. They would get shot down pretty damn quickly. The purpose of F-16s, as far as I can see, is a morale boost on the one side, and maybe they will have a certain effectiveness when it comes to shooting down slow moving, because that's what they are, drone attacks on Kiev and other such cities. But no, not when it comes to flying deep into Russian territory. In other words, Russia recognizes that when it comes to air superiority, no side really has it. The era of air superiority, at least in terms of this sort of war, has gone. What we've got is drone warfare. What we've got is missile warfare. Either way, it's 155-mile range, this missile. Now, the United States has got other missiles, of course, which it's either supplied, which have got a slightly longer range, and it's got other missiles which it could easily supply, which have got, how should I put it, an extra 100-mile range. Either way, Russia has been forced to pull back, its aircraft, pull back its command posts, strengthen or pull back its storage facilities. Now that matters when it comes to supplying the troops on the ground. So if you can hit, for example, a railhead, that is going to disrupt Russian supply. It's not going to stop it, but that would affect the war, but only, in my view at least, in a marginal sense. So I don't see these missiles being a winner for Ukraine. I think they'll make a marginal difference, but nothing decisive. But precisely what we get is this rhetoric. What was it? turning Kiev into a grey blob. I don't think that's going to happen. On the other hand, we have had at least, how should I put it, increased rhetoric from the NATO side, not only about storm shadows. I heard the other week the foreign minister of Poland talking about or speculating about the possibility of supporting or protecting Ukrainian nuclear facilities from potential Russian threat. Now, I don't buy into the idea that Russia is targeting Ukrainian nuclear facilities, but we do know that Ukraine has targeted Russian-held, and I do use the word purposely, Russian-held nuclear facilities. They have targeted that, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has, thrown up its hands and said, "Are you crazy?" And to me, this is just another argument in terms of my angle on the inadvisability of so-called peaceful nuclear power. In my view, nuclear power is dangerous. It's linked in with the military. It has no other rational use to it. It's expensive, it's dangerous, it takes an awful long time to get up. We don't want more nuclear. We want to decommission nuclear. And that can take tens, hundreds of years. I was reading about Britain's nuclear facilities. There was a time period put of, I think it was 130 years before you could reuse this site that they've just decommissioned. Okay, of course, we've also had the expulsion of 6 British diplomats. This is a warning shot, but as I said, at least in terms of my assessment, we know what route we're traveling on. We need to go back. We need to look at the bigger picture. This isn't a war simply between a big Russian bear and poor little Ukraine. That's how it's portrayed in the Western media, an unprovoked attack. We need to put it in the context of a declining US hegemon, a hegemon that doesn't face any sort of serious challenge from Russia, but it does face a serious challenge from China. And we need to understand what's going on in Ukraine precisely in that context. We need to understand what happened in 2014 with the Maidan coup. We need to understand all of NATO's expansion, not simply against Russia, which of course it is directed against, but crucially, at the end of the day, this is about China. And in my view, we are not, I hope, heading for a generalized nuclear exchange. That would be disastrous for all of us, for all of humanity. But we are heading towards an escalation of war threats. And clearly, the aim of the United States is to bring about regime change in Moscow through its war in Ukraine not going well, leading to the toppling or the retiring of Putin. And they would be hoping for someone like a Yeltsin, someone like a Navalny to come in. And if that was done, that's a big ask. It's by no means something that you go, that's clearly going to happen, isn't it? You could have completely the opposite sort of replacement. You don't need to get someone like a Yeltsin or someone like a Navalny. You could get a super, excuse me, I want to have a cough, a super aggressive replacement. That's quite conceivable. But no, but what the United States is banking on is replacing the Putin FSB regime with a pliant regime, some sort of neo-colonial arrangement, and that would surround China. So China would be surrounded from the north, it would be surrounded from the south with India, it will be surrounded from the east with the American fleet. That's the American aim. Its aim is to strangle China, to reduce China to a supplicant, not to recruit it into the imperialist hierarchy, but precisely to do what it did to the former Soviet Union, which is reduce it to poverty and dependency. Clearly something that Putin was put in to reverse. There you are. That's that section. Let's just quickly look at the latest military situation. I take seriously talk of Rust in the Donbass being a strategically important town. I didn't take talk of Bakhmut being a strategically important town. Yes, it was symbolically important to both sides. Both sides were prepared to sacrifice thousands of troops in order to keep it or in order to take it. But once Russia had taken it, did it change the situation? Did it change the military situation in the Donbass in any dramatic way? I simply look at it and go, well, no. But that is not the case as I understand it. And I'm not just reading one source, I'm reading a whole series of different so-called experts, and I'm certainly no expert. But this would open up the possibility, I don't think this year, but perhaps next year, of Russia taking the whole of the Donbass. That's the fear on the Ukrainian side. That's the fear on the NATO stroke American side. Meanwhile, you've got Kursk. We're told that Russia has organized this or that offensive operation. I see no sign of some sort of disaster pending for Ukraine. I could be totally wrong on this one. At the moment, the Russian high command, Putin, and the regime seem quite content to contain Ukrainian forces in the Kursk oblast and squeeze them, but meanwhile continue their push to the west in Donbass, grind forward. Now that's going to be limited, and that's going to depend on, to a large extent, on the weather, when the weather changes. And I'm not sure in that part of Ukraine exactly when the weather changes, and I don't suppose it comes on any exact basis. Nonetheless, when it comes to spring, when it comes to autumn, what you have is the mud season. And when I mean mud, I mean mud. Mud that's so deep that if you run your tank too slowly, it gets stuck, let alone, soft-skinned trucks that are delivering food, ammunition, and all the other vital supplies for the front line. Agricultural track turns into a quagmire. So I'm reminded, actually, in terms of reporting of some of this stuff, The Sun, bizarrely, is one of the best papers to read. But I'm reminded of a Sun reporter who was out there looking at our glorious Challenger 2 tanks and how they were performing now in Ukrainian hands. And the Ukrainian crew, who just learned how to operate this piece of relatively extraordinarily expensive equipment, plowed it forward into the mud, and there it got stuck, and they had to get load of equipment to drag it out of the mud. That's an illustration of why you don't tend to have offensive operations in Ukraine in the spring or the autumn. And autumn is fast approaching here, but also in Ukraine. So my own estimate is that things look like grinding on, with people dying needlessly on both sides. What I would add is that, of course, we don't just have fierce fighting. We'll have an awful lot of quiet fronts. And what you get there, and any general will tell you, anybody who knows anything about military matters will tell you, under those circumstances, the grunts on the ground, and we're not only talking about privates and sergeants and corporals, even the captains know it perfectly well. It's better to live and let live under those circumstances. So when you're living in a situation, the rain is bucketing down, it's just horrible with the mud and the cold. When you're clearing out your trenches, you basically come to a sort of nod and a wink. Not that you can see the nod or the wink, but you come to an agreement with the other side. Look, if you don't shoot us, we won't shoot you. And I'm not looking to that as a way out of this hellhole, but I am looking at it on the basis of that would be something we would welcome as internationalists, as something that we would be urging troops to turn their guns against their generals and against their politicians, against their rulers. But what about the social imperialists? What about them? Would they urge fraternization? I doubt it. And indeed, if we look at Britain, I just want to finish just by talking not only about the winter fuel payment question, but precisely the question of guns or butter. Because, yeah, I don't know what the exact total is, but we're told that an awful lot of pensioners, is it 10 million, is it 11 million? But that will include an awful lot of pensioners that are eligible but haven't applied, and perhaps, this is the estimate, won't apply. I think it's just under 1 million of them could be eligible for these winter fuel payments, but for one reason or another haven't applied for them, won't apply for them. But we're told that this is because Rachel Reeves finds herself in a terrible situation because of the Tory government. We have all this talk about a 22 billion black hole. Partially, of course, that's in order to pay these greedy junior doctors who actually, don't want to live hand to mouth. What a disgrace. It's in order to pay rail workers. It's there to pay all government workers. So the black hole is partially the sort of Tories holding back on coming to some wage deal, which they would have come to in one form or another. So partially, this is, how should we put it, a bit of window dressing for austerity, an excuse for austerity, but there's a reality to it. Britain certainly isn't awash with money. So there's cost cutting going on, and we've heard Keir Starmer, no more money for the NHS unless there's reform. Well, he's promising some sort of reform. Either way, the message seems to be gloom, gloom, gloom. Don't ask because you ain't going to be given. And even if you fight, we ain't going to give. So don't fight. That seems to be the message that they're coming forward with this October with the budget. But when it comes to Ukraine, I notice that not only did the Tory government give huge amounts, we're not talking about, wartime amounts, but nonetheless huge amounts, but so is the Labour government. And we haven't heard any statements from the Defence Secretary or the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister that they're going to go down a German route and cut aid to Ukraine. So we have on the one side this 22 billion black hole, but we also have a situation where Britain has supplied and will continue to supply billions of aid to Ukraine. I think the figure thus far, this is under the Tories and now under Labour, thus far is something in the region of £10 billion. So that's something like half this so-called black hole. So when it comes to fighting wars, okay, a proxy war, there's the money there. The money will still keep coming from the United States, presuming that Harris wins and not Trump in November. It will certainly keep coming from Britain. Meanwhile, if you look at the social imperialist press, anti-capitalist resistance, if you look at the AWL, what they run is with their press, no to cuts, give us a pay rise, no to the withdrawal of winter fuel payments from pensioners. So I'm reminded of that famous phrase, guns or butter. And he definitely didn't coin the phrase, but the phrase is famously associated with Hermann Göring in the Nazi regime in the 1930s. And he actually put forward the choice to the German people. And he said, you can either have guns or butter. Now, in the 60s, if I remember right, maybe it was, I think it was the 60s, Lyndon Johnson's administration said you could have both. But the reality is you have one or the other. Anyway, back to my story of Hermann Göring. He said you can either have guns, that makes you powerful, or you can have butter, and that makes you fat. If you have to see a picture of Hermann Göring, you have to say that he was used to eating an awful lot of butter. But the point is there. We're not talking, I don't want to go into, Keynesian stimulus and how well the American arms industry is doing, because it's doing very well, thank you very much. Because as well as supplying Ukraine, they're yanking up the pressure on other NATO powers and other countries in the world to spend on American arms. But for the imperialist left, for the social imperialist left, we ought to ask them, demand that they take ownership of spending on guns instead of butter. Because of course, what butter stands for isn't some indulgence, it's basic needs of the population. That's actually the choice that Hermann Göring was posing. You can have guns or you can have better living standards, and we're going to choose guns. And that is what the Starmer government is doing, and that's what the Biden administration has been doing in the United States.